Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, January 14th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recordings of this series of programs and links to the articles we refer to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at carl@newsfromneptune.com. That's Carl with a C. Our program concentrates on the news of U.S. war making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. Since 1945, the United States government has killed over 20 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Latin America, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic hegemony that the U.S. inherited as the only largely undamaged major country in World War II. Russia lost 27 million people in defeating Nazism. The U.S. lost 500,000 in World War II as a whole. Now we have the Trump administration's assassination, while apparently on a peace mission, of Iran's leading general and the leader of Iran's war against ISIS, which the U.S. was responsible for originating, followed by the demand by the Iraqi government that American troops leave Iraq, which the Bush administration invaded 17 years ago in the greatest war crime of the 21st century. Trump should be impeached immediately for the high crime he committed, the assassination of a foreign leader, and not for the nonsense in the House resolutions, which are based on his hesitation to kill Ukrainians. His predecessors had few hesitations in such matters. Incidentally, Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate for president in the last election, is one of the few U.S. politicians, even within the Green Party, who said anything sensible about this presidential murder. She wrote, "Now this, the murder of Soleimani, is grounds for impeachment, treachery unleashing the unthinkable for Americans and people the world over. Trump asked the Iraqi Prime Minister to mediate with Iran and then assassinated General Soleimani on a mediation mission. This is stunning. The Iraq Prime Minister tells the Parliament that the U.S. troops should leave Iraq. He says Donald Trump called him to ask him to mediate with Iran and then ordered a drone strike on General Soleimani. Says Soleimani was carrying a response to a Saudi initiative to defuse tensions when he was hit." Now, the U.S., we remember, has been saying since the invasion of Iraq in the widely attributed comment to American leaders, the boys go to Iraq, real men go to Tehran, that is the capital of Iran. So, the war has been contemplated by the U.S. leadership for more than a generation. The U.S. has been torturing Iran for 70 years at least, since the CIA overthrew an elected government there. So the prospect of war with Iran has been part of neoconservative planning in Washington for 2 generations at least. The U.S. political establishment, which has aggressively conducted American Empire War, as it's called, in the Obama administration and long before, very much wants us to believe that Trump is the problem, so that the war-making can continue undisturbed with his departure. It's a particularly cynical attempt to mislead U.S. public opinion. Trump was the first major party presidential candidate in 40 years to attack the government's expanding neocon and neolib policies. Those are policies that make for more war and more austerity. Those attacks made Trump president. That sounded good to enough Americans to get him elected. It was not American racism that got him elected, as the Democrats insist, but the things he had to say about the government policy that affected the lives of most Americans. The tragedy is that in office, Trump has accepted those very policies that he attacked. during the campaign. Obama was the first U.S. president ever to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. That's hard to believe, but it was the case. But we may, with luck, have an election this year between 2 candidates thrown up by the burgeoning populist wave, Trump and Sanders. Populism being the conviction that, as I quote, a virtuous and homogeneous people is under attack from a set of elites and dangerous others who are together depicted as depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice. That's the description of the populist move, the mood that that made Trump president and has produced Sanders as the obvious frontrunner in the Democrat Party as well. The notion of a Trump versus Sanders presidential election scares the American ruling class to death. The idea that these 2 products of this populist enthusiasm in the United States should be the major choices in the presidential election causes sleepless nights in the homes of the 1%. The political establishment, political arrangement, everything from the parties to the Pentagon, who are working for that 1%, are desperate to see that the populist wave is suppressed in both parties, and that conventional candidates like Pence and Biden confront one another in the 2020 presidential election, so that American empire war and immiseration will continue as it has for literally generations. Retired U.S. Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Secretary of State Colin Powell's chief of staff in the Bush administration, says that the escalation of tensions between the U.S. and Iran today is a continuation of 2 decades of U.S. policy in the Middle East. On the program Democracy Now!, Wilkerson said, and I quote, "America exists today to make war. How else do we interpret 18 straight years of war and no end in sight? It's part of who we are. It's part of what the American empire is. We're going to lie, cheat, and steal," as Secretary of State Pompeo said, and as he is doing right now, as Trump is doing right now, as Esper, the defense secretary, is doing right now, as Lindsey Graham, the senator, is doing right now, as Tom Cotton is doing right now, and a host of other members of my political party, the Republicans, this is Larry Wilkerson talking about these matters, are doing right now. We're going to cheat and steal to do whatever it is we have to do to continue this war complex. That's the truth of it, and that's the agony of it. Lawrence Wilkerson continues, what we saw President Trump do, he's referring to the assassination, was not in President Trump's character, really. Those boys and girls who were getting on those planes at Fort Bragg to augment forces in Iraq, if you looked at their faces, and even more importantly, if you looked at the faces of the families assembled along the line that they were traversing to get into the airplanes, you saw a lot of Donald Trump's base. That base voted for Donald Trump because he promised to end these endless wars. He promised to drain the swamp. Well, as I said, an alligator from that swamp jumped out and bit him. And when he ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, he was a member of the national security state in good standing, and all that state knows how to do is make war, close quote. That's Lawrence Wilkerson, who was aide to Secretary of State Colin Powell in the Bush administration, talking about what's going on in Washington right now. At that point in this discussion on Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman, the host of Democracy Now!, speaking for the political establishment, jumps in and says, I want to turn to President Trump. Yes, of course she does, because the official line for the American political establishment is that this is all Trump's fault, and if we can just remove him and put someone like Pence, or maybe even Hillary Clinton, in place, then we can go back to warfare as usual without worrying about the criticisms that Trump offered in the campaign, and he's been excused for by the impression of the neocon policies in the White House. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the events of the last political week in the U.S. and the war scare that we're in the midst of. On the 11th, 3 days ago, the anti-government protests in Iran were reported in this country, and the account led the U.S. to actualize a form of political interference that has been the standard operating procedure of the CIA literally for generations. The protests in Iran against the shooting down of the Ukrainian airline was featured in the American news as an example of complaints by the Iranian population against the existing government in Iran. As we know, Iran announced the Ukrainian airliner was accidentally shot down, 176 people killed, by an anti-air unit in Iran. There are lots of open questions in this regard. The focus now is on the timing of the announcement and the spin on the matter by both the Iranian government and the American government. On the day of the Iranian announcement, small anti-government protests popped up in Iran, primarily by university students, so often the empire's favorite subjects, that is, the U.S. Using university students for its own purposes. Hundreds, perhaps no more, on the day of the Iranian announcement of its responsibility for the shoot-down. One initial thing to note is just how organized those protests in Tehran and Iran seem to be. There are videos circulating of the protesters wearing body armor, acting in teams to draw in riot police, shining lasers from the tops of buildings. We've seen these tactics before in Ukraine in the revolution that the U.S. prompted against an elected president in Ukraine and in Hong Kong. This is not an accident, because all of these clearly are influenced, if nothing more, by the CIA. They indicate a high level of training and preparedness among these protesters. This is not some spur-of-the-moment uprising, but rather an organized event with elements trained with the usual CIA textbook. This is not new. The highly unusual personal presence of the British ambassador at the site of the protests in Tehran also points to this, and perhaps also to the degree of importance that these protests hold for the regime change camp. But the most interesting thing here is the slogans the protesters used. There were some dumb Khamenei resign protests, clearly from an auto cue written by Americans with no idea how the spiritual leadership of Iran actually works. But the main tagline for these protests was "Death to Liars." Now, this doesn't make much sense. For the protests that took place after the government had just told the truth in the most honest and candid way any government ever has, how does death to liars figure? That is, the government of Iran admitted, after first denying it, that it was responsible for the shoot down of the Ukrainian airplane, which it said was a tragic mistake. In no world does delaying the truth for a few days justify the chant "death to liars." Why were the protesters in Tehran calling the Iranian government liars? There is a context in which it would make much more sense, given the clearly prepared and artificial nature of these protests. It's incredibly easy to imagine what the actual intention of the whole charade was. Iran has been set up in more ways than one. In addition to being somehow tricked into downing the plane, if that's indeed what happened, it's likely that the U.S. had evidence that would expose Iran's responsibility. The U.S. had been relying on Iran denying the allegations that it was responsible for the shootdown, or at least withholding the truth for longer, allowing it to come out, allowing the U.S. to come out with the evidence and outing Iran as liars, either directly or via someone like Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, who seemed disappointed when Iran came out with the truth. A good number of the passengers killed were Canadians. This would then be swiftly followed by the prepared and coordinated student protests, which in context of the planned scenario would likely have drawn in much more support and would have had a far more detrimental effect on Iran's integrity, both domestically and abroad. Perhaps this was planned all along as an American response to Iran's, or at least as an alternative to open war. Trick Iran into downing the airliner, let them keep the secret, then expose them and set trained anti-government dogs loosed in the streets to be joined by masses. It was a devious and ruthlessly effective plan, or it would have been, except that Iran came out with the truth only days after the event and upset the entire plot. Now the student protesters had slogans that no longer made sense, "Death to liars," and no support whatsoever from the actual population at large, who had witnessed a great show of integrity from their government on the global stage. This is the first way in which Iran scuppered the plan. Indeed, depending on how long this plan had been concocted, it might even be reasonable to say that the millions of people that came out to martyr Soleimani's funeral also dented the plan well in advance. The second or third way in which this plan had been foiled comes from Fars News, that's the Iranian news service, report on the protests. Some slow-witted Western analysts have taken Fars' reporting on the story as a sign of division with Iranian ranks and drew up wild fantasy stories on that basis. But the reality is a lot different. Far from a sign of division in the political and military ranks in Iran, anyone with half a brain can understand what this report is about. Considering the outpouring of emotion over Soleimani's martyrdom, anyone hearing of people ripping the posters down would quickly hate those people a lot. Thus, even if there had been any potential left for normal Iranians to join these protests, the moment it's revealed that they're ripping down Soleimani's poster, people are 100% more likely to try and punch these protesters in the head than they are to join them. Thus, the U.S. plan seems to have been, 1, trick Iran into downing the airliner. This is the most, and it surely may have been an accident, but there are reasons to believe that the U.S., mainly that it's done it before, the so-called color revolutions across the world. Second, presume that Iran will hold the guilty secret, that they won't admit that they're responsible for the shoot down of the plane. And 3, expose them and incite large-scale protests. That was the U.S. plan, it suggested. We see evidence in this, and first of all, the Ukrainian and Hong Kong style coordinated actions of protesters. If we look at protesters in Ukraine and Hong Kong recently, it's hard not to suggest that there are CIA operatives mulling about in these waters attempting to produce exactly the riots that have occurred. 2, unconvincing reasons for the demonstration, that is, death to liars. I mean, in fact, the government wasn't lying in Tehran. 3, the out-of-place slogans, like death to liars, given the new reality Iran imposed upon the context, the fact that Iran admitted it was responsible for the shooting down and the death of shooting out of the plane and the death of its passengers. And 4, the presence of the UK ambassador at the site. He was arrested, in fact, for encouraging protests in Tehran. So what could have been a dangerous ploy And the latest desperate attempt to get rid of the Iran problem without going to war was defeated in the three stages. First of all, millions mourning Soleimani, the assassinated general from Iran. Two, Iran's clever and quick admission of guilt, realizing that to deny it any longer would not work. And three, the isolation and exposition of protesters. The final blow to this plan could occur in coming days if pro-government rallies form, insisting on further avenging Soleimani's blood, and insisting the focus not be shifted away from the crime, by the U.S., that led to his martyrdom. It seems like a very feasible sequence of events, but it's based on nothing but the analysis that one can make of the confused accounts that we get from international news sources. As usual, the Americans are trying to play chess with the Persians and can win in neither that nor war, or so it's suggested. The U.S. has been torturing Iran for all these years, and the notion is that this is one more step in that process. We should be more aware than we are of the so-called color revolutions. The color revolutions were the resistance that former Soviet Union states and Eastern European republics that made their own counter version of the breakup of the Soviet Union, beginning with the Velvet Revolution in 1989 in the Czech Republic, the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution, whenever it came up with this color coding for these popular attempts to produce new governments in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union, has a lot of explaining to do, particularly for ones like the Tulip Resolution, so help me, in Kyrgyzstan. And then in the Arab world, the Arab Spring produced the Purple Revolution, the Iraq's 2005 revolution, the Cedar Revolution, Lebanon's end of the Syrian occupation or military presence in 2005. What happened as these popular uprisings occur, the American CIA, decided that they could be used for the purposes of American foreign policy and did all they could to encourage them when they occurred in the countries of official enemies of the United States. It suggested that the peak of the color revolution trend was the color revolution sponsored by the Obama administration in Ukraine that produced the overthrow of an elected president in Ukraine and served the interests of the United States, not Ukraine, by producing a government in that country that included explicit Nazis. This is what the Obama administration did. Color revolutions had become a tool of American foreign policy that had the extra added advantage of not using American draftees to accomplish the overthrow of governments that America was interested in. It seems to me that we're examining another color revolution, or the attempt by the CIA to produce a color revolution these days in Hong Kong and in Iran. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the foreign policy, military and otherwise, of the United States. It's suggested that the long-planned U.S. assassinations, notably that of General Soleimani, will increase the political chaos in the region, and that's hardly surprising. The Trump administration has given various justifications for its assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani and Commander Abu Mahdi du Mohandes. He was the Iraqi leader who was with Soleimani when the U.S. droned their car. It claimed that there was an imminent threat. This was the Trump administration's language of an incident, that is, an attack on American interests, even while not knowing what, where, or when it would happen, that made the assassination of General Soleimani necessary. Trump later said The threat was a planned bombing of 4 U.S. embassies. His defense secretary said it wasn't. Now his new defense secretary, and the Secretary of State have admitted that there was no imminent threat, that it was a lie. But that's what the administration put forward for its killing of General Soleimani. Raised the suspicion the decision to kill Soleimani had little to do with current events, but was a long-planned operation. NBC News, of all people, mainstream media, now reports that that was exactly the case. President Donald Trump authorized the killing of Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani 7 months ago. If Iran's increased aggression, that was the administration's talk, resulted in the death of an American, according to 5 current and former senior administration officials. So not a single source, but this is what the administration was clearly planning. The presidential directive in June came with the condition that Trump would have final sign-off on any specific operation to kill Soleimani, the official said. One can see here a fight between the neocons in the administration and those, perhaps Trump himself, who take seriously Trump's talk in the campaign of ending these endless wars. The idea to kill Soleimani, a regular general in an army with which the U.S. is not at war, came, like many other bad ideas, from John Bolton. After Iran shot down a U.S. drone in June, John Bolton, Trump's national security advisor at the time, urged Trump to retaliate by signing off on an operation to kill Soleimani. Officials said this wasn't new. This is what Bolton was pushing long before. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also wanted Trump to authorize the assassination, officials said. But Trump rejected the idea, saying he'd take that step only if Iran crossed his red line, killing Americans. The president's message was, that's only on the table if they hit Americans, according to a person briefed on the discussion. This is NBC that's reporting this, and it's not been denied. Then unknown forces fired 30 short-range missiles into a U.S. base near Kirkuk. The salvo was not intended to kill or wound anyone. The rockets landed in a place and a time when American and Iraqi personnel normally were not there. It was only by unlucky chance that a Mr. Hamed was killed, American officials said. Without presenting any evidence, the U.S. accused Kataib Hezbollah, an Iraqi popular militia unit, of having launched the missiles. It launched airstrikes against a number of Kataib Hezbollah positions near the Syrian border, hundreds of miles away from Kirkuk, and killed over 30 Iraqi security forces. This led to demonstrations in Baghdad, during which a crowd breached the outer wall of the U.S. Embassy, but soon retreated. Trump, who'd attacked Hillary Clinton over the 2012 raid on the consulate and CIA station in Benghazi, did not want to get embarrassed with a full embassy breach. The media claimed that it was the embassy breach that led to the activation of an operation that had already been planned for a year before Trump signed off on it 7 months ago. As the New York Times describes it, for the past 18 months, officials said, there's been discussions about whether to target General Soleimani. Figuring that it would be too difficult to hit him in Iran, officials contemplated going after him during one of his frequent visits to Syria or Iraq, and focused on developing agents in 7 different entities to report on his movements: the Syrian army, the Quds force in Damascus, Hezbollah in Damascus, the Damascus and Baghdad airports, and the Kataib Hezbollah and Popular Mobilization forces in Iraq. It was the embassy breach and a war industry lobbyist who convinced Trump to finally pull the symbolic trigger. Defense Secretary Mark Esper, he used to work for defense contractors, presented a series of response options to the president 2 weeks ago, including killing Soleimani. Esper presented the pros and cons of such an operation, but made it clear that he was in favor of taking out Soleimani, a phrase that's turned up an awful lot in American discussion recently. Taking out talks about killing foreign officials. Trump signed off, and it further developed from there. There was no intelligence of any imminent threat or anything like that. This was an operation that they'd worked on for 18 months. Trump signed off on it more than half a year ago. Those who had planned it just waited for a chance to execute it. We can now be sure that the embassy bombing had caused Trump to give the final go. It might have been that the CIA and Pentagon were just waiting for a chance to kill Soleimani and Mohandas, the leader of Kataib Hezbollah, at the same time. Their meeting at Baghdad airport was not secret and provided the convenient opportunity they'd been waiting on. Together, Soleimani and Mohandas were the glue that kept the many Shia factions in Iraq together, the armed ones as well as the political ones. Soleimani's replacement as Quds Brigade leader, Brigadier General Ismail Qani, is certainly a capable man, but his previous field of work was mainly east of Iran and Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it would be difficult for him to fill Soleimani's role in Iraq. After Soleimani's death, Ayatollah Khamenei appointed Soleimani's deputy Ismail Qani to succeed him. Qani does not speak Arabic, does not have an in-depth knowledge of Iraq, nor the insight of Soleimani and his ability to balance the different position of Iraq's factions with the opinions of Ayatollah Khamenei and the religious authorities in Iran. The question is how the successor of Soleimani will manage his new responsibility, including the thorny issues in Iraq. The escalation of the Iranian-American conflict is, according to many, an escalation towards war and the destabilization of the region in which the rules of engagement have changed. The question remains how, and not whether, any of this will impact the situation in Iraq. You have been listening to Aware on the Air, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Updates as of this morning, Tuesday, January 14th, the Defense Secretary of the United States says the U.S. could strike Iran or proxies where legally available and appropriate, and threatens a further expansion of the war. Attorney General Barr and Secretary of State Pompeo shifted the justification for their strikes on Iran from imminent threats. They now admit that there was no imminent threat, that they were lying, to deterrence. And this is the present justification for the U.S. Continuation of attacks on Iran. We'll conclude tonight with Jimmy Dore on the Jesse Ventura Show on YouTube, a link provided by our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, as is much else on our program. See his notes on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Comments on this program are welcome. Email me at carl@newsfromneptune.com. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others were real whistleblowers, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, including our liberal Democrat Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda, and unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, who's being tortured in prison by the U.S. government for the crime of telling the truth about our government's war crimes, something most Americans thought happened only in dictatorships. Perhaps they're right. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.